You're letting people in?
Yeah. I'm going to start letting people in.
Welcome everybody. Good afternoon. We'll just wait a minute as people trickle in. Glad you're all here. Welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a minute. Thanks for coming. Welcome everybody, welcome. Welcome everybody. All right, we're 2 minutes past. I usually give a couple of minutes before we get the ball rolling officially. So let's open the webinar officially. Welcome everybody. Glad you're all here. Thank you for coming this afternoon. We've got a very exciting show on today. For the next hour, we've got a fantastic presenter, which I'll introduce in a minute. This is of course, part of our Recovery Science Series webinars. It's hosted by the Recovery Research Institute here at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, but it is sponsored by SAMHSA and the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry, and it is part of the Opioid Response Network. As you can see the logo down on the bottom left, this network provides expert consultation, training, and education on recovery support services for opioid, stimulant, and other substance use disorders. Can you give us the next slide? We're just going to start off with a very brief video it's like a 2-minute video, which explains kind of what the Opioid Response Network is, what it's about, who it serves, what it's for, and then I'll pick it up in a couple of minutes. So Maya, if you want to click that.
Address opioid and stimulant use and the overdose crisis. You can't overcome this alone, but we can, together, and we are. We are the Opioid Response Network, a coalition of 40 national organizations representing more than 2 million people. We serve all 50 states and 9 territories locally through our network of nearly 1,000 professionals working across prevention, treatment, and recovery. For state agencies, organizations big and small, and individuals working to address local needs, we bring training and education to bear on your efforts. We're here to help you help others through evidence-based support, all at no cost to you. For instance, the Opioid Response Network helped the Tribal College in New Mexico join forces with local organizations to develop a culturally appropriate prevention, treatment, and recovery training series for its students. In Rhode Island, we convened correction staff from 34 states to share how our program had reduced post-incarceration overdose deaths by more than 60% and supported them in their efforts to build similar programs in their home states. In West Virginia, we mobilized to help a clinic incorporate substance use disorder services into their practice, serving a faith-based community. We helped healthcare providers in South Dakota address barriers they face providing treatment services for their patients. We're here to help those on the front lines. So, what are your needs and how can we help? Visit the opioidresponsenetwork.org to learn more and to submit a request for support. The Opioid Response Network, funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Communities across.
Great, thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Maya. Thanks, everybody, for your attention. Hopefully that was informative. And, you know, it's just a marvelous free resource that is available through the Opioid Response Network. that provides all this technical assistance and training. So please spread the word amongst your colleagues. It's a free service, so we can improve the quality, effectiveness, as well as quantity of treatment for opioid, stimulant, and other substance use disorders around the country to help more people and their families. In terms of this series, where we're trying to obviously inform and amplify what is known about these services, we've had a long list of webinars that are available on our website. So feel free to go check out any of the former webinars we've had in the past over the last couple of years now. And next slide. So to begin with today, before I introduce our wonderful speaker, we have a brief poll just to keep track of who's here and kind of what the needs are of you all, as well as how we can better provide the content of the webinars. If you could just fill out this brief poll, just take 30 seconds to do that and hit submit, and then we can get going. Thank you. This is check all that apply. You have to scroll down, don't forget to get to the other questions below before you can hit submit. Just 4 questions. All righty, just a few more seconds. Hopefully it wasn't too difficult. So how are we doing there, Maya?
Good. Yes, we're about at 75%. So I can go ahead and end the poll and share the results briefly if people want to take a look.
Beautiful. Thanks very much. Yeah, so you can just take a look at who's here and where people are from and affiliations, etc., as well as, yeah. So thank you for doing that. Much appreciated. All right, on with the show here. And today we're really honored to have a fantastic focus and a fantastic speaker. Dr. Ashli Sheidow is a clinical psychologist and a senior research scientist in the Lighthouse Institute of Chestnut Health Systems. She's a health services researcher focused on adolescents and emerging adults, particularly young people who have substance use problems and legal system involvement. She researches the effective delivery of evidence-based practices in the real world, which includes improving training supports and task shifting in low-resourced environments like rural communities. Ashli's work is focused also on recovery support services and community-engaged research with and by people who have lived experience in recovery and the legal system. And today, Ashli is going to be speaking on considerations for addressing substance use disorder in emerging adults. So Ashli, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much for coming and doing this. Looking forward to it.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's an honor to present. I love seeing the diversity of folks that are here and those folks that are bringing just varied expertise to the table. So, and please use the chat to share your wisdom on this topic as well. The more we can learn from each other, the better. I also hope that you'll feel free to reach out to me if there's a shared interest that you hear about. Today, I'd love to connect and to be helpful to you if I can. So please reach out. So today I'll focus on things that I think are important when considering treatment services for substance use in emerging adults. Next slide. And I want to pause to give thanks to NIDA for financial support and also to the partners, the many, many partners I've had on these efforts. And then also a few disclaimers. I co-own ARENA, which is a small business focused on contingency management for emerging adults, as well as teens and adults, and then also Science to Practice group that's focused on multisystemic therapy for emerging adults, which I won't talk much about those today, but always best to be transparent. Next slide. So I want to start off with a thought experiment. I'm going to put a link in the chat. And if folks can go to that link, let's see if I can get there. If folks can go to that link, it's an idea boards. For those of you who aren't familiar, it's a little like Jamboard if you've done those. you click the little plus sign and it creates a new sticky for you to put on. And I want to answer this question. What do you think about when you think of emerging adults? What do you think about? Good, bad, and ugly. What are the things that you think about when you hear the term emerging adults or think about emerging adults? And you can also upvote. If you see something that someone else has put, you can upvote that by clicking on the little plus sign underneath. I'll give you a minute or two. Yeah, lots of things. Oh, okay. All of a sudden mine popped up. Must have done a refresh. Independent thinking, finding themselves, changes. Oh, lots and lots of changes. We'll talk about those today. Developing stress and increased responsibility, independence and choice. Yeah, transitioning into adulthood. A lot of folks use the term transition age youth as well for this age group. Growing, yeah. College age, future innovation, future innovators, right? They're the future. That's good. Growing. Change. This is a good one. Changes to the kind of care they access. I know there were a lot of providers and practitioners when we looked, so y'all feel that acutely, I'm sure. Yeah, exciting time. I love it. I love that there's sort of this nice balance. So thank you all, and feel free to continue adding. I think that sort of provides helpful context for some of our discussion today. So next slide. This just is a range of the topics that I'm going to talk about today, and I'll at least try to get to most of them, maybe not all of them, but I'll start by talking about emerging adulthood as a unique stage. So next slide. We have a couple of photos that'll pop up. Young people, we're talking about, the age of 16, 17, all the way up to the mid-20s. And some folks even call this range up to age 30. And these individuals are presenting unique characteristics. They have these functional abilities that are increasing as they go through psychosocial development in this life phase. So they're experiencing a variety of normative transitions that you see popping up there on the screen. And we're expecting them to master key skills and competencies such as the ones listed on this slide. And many of you listed these things on those sticky notes as well. So you feel this acutely. However, as they're going through this, emerging adults are encountering specific barriers to getting these successful transitions to happen. Next slide. So the first barrier is mental health symptoms, and the onset of mental health symptoms, mental health conditions occurs primarily during this age range. And in fact, that slide, you'll see 64% of mental health conditions have onset by the age of 21. Next slide. And so, in fact, the emerging adults have the highest rates of suicidality, and you'll see a circle pop up in just a second. And Maya's helping me, so bear with us. I appreciate y'all's patience. They have the highest suicidality rates compared to other age groups. And the outcomes for emerging adults with mental health disorders are particularly concerning. For example, 42%, there's a 42% unemployment rate among young adults who have a mental health condition. There's a 45% dropout rate from high school and 30% rate of being unhoused, and the risks that go along with that. Next slide. So the second barrier is for emerging adults successfully transitioning into adulthood is substance use. And again, sort of the circle will come up and show you that the prevalence of substance use disorders is higher in emerging adulthood compared to any other developmental period. And they're disproportionately affected by the current opioid epidemic. And compounding that, this slide is sort of focused on the the prevalence of mental health and co-occurring substance use disorders, and showing that that's higher among emerging adults compared to other age groups. In fact, it's more than double the prevalence found in the more mature adults. But beyond this, for emerging adults, polysubstance use is a particular concern. For emerging adults who misuse opioids, they almost always universally have polysubstance use. 96% is some of the recent numbers. So for this age group, targeting polysubstance use is really critical given that high rate of co-use, and particularly because, as I know you all know well, it increases the risk for adverse outcomes like overdose deaths. So particularly concerning for this age group. Next slide. And the third barrier is serious conduct problems. So late adolescence, you'll see the circle pop up next. Late adolescence and early adulthood marks the peak age for antisocial and criminal activity as well. So another barrier. And if we can go to the next slide, I can't touch on this without highlighting what you all, again, probably already know, that Black and Native American youth in our country are more likely to be confined in our legal system. And so that structural racism and overrepresentation of youth of color in the legal system, that has obviously a direct and immediate impact for the individuals and the families, but it also has impacted the socio-ecological factors that are present for young people and their communities that they're growing up in and trying to do this developmental transition. And our society sort of created this continual cycle of disadvantage when you think of it from a socio-ecological or a recovery capital viewpoint. So I feel like that's important for us to all acknowledge. Next slide. A fourth area in which emerging adults struggle is violent victimization. And you'll see the circle that comes up so you can pinpoint the 18 to 25-year-olds. These individuals have alarming rates of victimization, violent victimization, that are far higher than the younger or older age groups. Next slide. And so finally, emerging adulthood has this peak age period for death by homicide. So again, the bottom line, they are an age group where services are desperately needed. But beyond these barriers, there are considerations that make them sort of really unique when you're thinking about it from services and treatment for them. Next slide. Emerging adulthood, so even in the absence of substance use or other problems, it's just a period of substantial psychological growth. It's a period that is characterized by sexual development and establishment of romantic relationships, family role changes, and identity formation. And this includes things like what I want to convey to the world and how I want the world to treat me, what I believe and what I value, and also deeply rooted foundations of who we are, like cultural identity and gender identity. I say it's striving to establish who am I, independent from my family and where I came from. Next slide. Another consideration is that emerging adults also usually represent a wider array of living situations versus other age groups. So they could be living on their own, they may be living with family or friends, they may be couch surfing, they may be unhoused, they also can have children of their own. So a wider array than you might typically have for a given population. And I want to comment on parents and caregivers of emerging adults for a moment. About half of emerging adults reside with their parents. And many of these emerging adults are the ones that need supports and services. And in my experience, the majority of parents and caregivers want supports to help them with their emerging adults. But those services may need to be more intensive than what communities currently provide. And I think this is where recovery peer services and other recovery support services can perhaps play a big part in communities. And I know Aaron Hogue and others are focused some on this. And then especially for post-episode inpatient and hospital care, that is a particular area of time, a particular area of need for support for families. My close colleague, Kristen Sajak, and I have some NIDA funding that's focused on that specifically. But I just want to say importantly that young people are often dumped in the family's lap after an episode of care without the family having the support to help sustain that young person's recovery. And so again, we're sort of setting them up for failure by definition. Next slide. So moving on, some characteristics of typical cognitive development also have to be considered when it comes to, or should be considered when it comes to treating emerging adults. We have, cognitive abilities are changing even up to age 30. We didn't know this like 2 or 3 decades ago. We didn't know this, but we know this now. And the certain areas of executive functioning that are the very last to develop, those are the things that can really impact treatment. So things like being planful and scheduling and the like, getting to your treatment appointments, getting to your services, persevering and working towards a goal over time, like taking steps towards reaching that treatment goal. That goal's out there, but taking those steps to reach that. And then using good judgment and decision making, and being sidetracked by impulsive decisions. Like you've got a treatment appointment, but you've got friends that call you suddenly and want to hang out and do something fun. So sort of that being sidetracked by those impulsive decisions. I like to summarize this sort of realm of things by saying this age group, they often know what to do to achieve a goal. They know, they talk the talk, but they struggle to enact the required steps to reach that, to get to that goal. And so they talk the talk, but when it comes to the walk, that's where the struggles start to be seen more. And those, the risk, the risk factors I talked about earlier, those prove there's an obvious need for effective treatments for emerging adults who have substance use, as well as mental health concerns, criminal behavior, and other co-occurring problems. And ideally, the treatments and services we have would consider all these developmental transitions that emerging adults are facing. But our current service system is set up to fail emerging adults. So let's go to the next slide. I like showing this crosswalk because the transition to adulthood represents challenges, even for the most well-adjusted, highly resourced youth navigating these new adult roles. I think, for myself, it's been a long time, but I think I've got 2 kids that are in this age range currently, and they have all the advantages in the world. But they still have a gajillion questions for me when it comes to like finding a new doctor in their town just for, the flu shot or whatever. They just, but they have me to come to. So for youth who are struggling, they're faced with that plus services that are either tailored to more of the young children or to more mature adults. And each system has its own funding source, its own eligibility criteria, its own culture, its own set of rules. And they often don't coordinate well with the other systems, and definitely not well when it comes from crossing from the child system to the adult system. It's very fragmented with very poor communication. And emerging adults sort of find themselves in this chasm in the middle that they have to figure out how to negotiate. So we know emerging adults have the highest rates of substance use, antisocial behavior, suicidality, homicidality, being victimized. So yes, they are a high-risk population, but that also means this is the single population with the highest return on investment if we can make a difference. So there's a lot of promise there that we could try to work on. But they're falling through the cracks with the way we've designed our service sectors. We can go to the next slide. And I guess one thing I do want to touch on before is that we have this siloing of funding that I like to emphasize to folks, is that it creates barriers to service access that have like no basis in reality of a young person's life. They often, one issue I've seen is that young people sometimes have to be attached to the legal system just to get good services. So just to get some of the evidence-based treatments that are out there, they have to get attached to the legal system, and that's not that doesn't have strong outcomes for them. It can, even parents are consistently prevented from getting the initial help and sustained help that they've had. And it often drives them to get their kid attached to the legal system for no other reason than to get access to services. There was a New York Times article that noted that the US has made it easy to get high and hard to get help. And that quote was just so powerful when I read it, because that is what I see on a daily basis for young people and their families. So I've got one last downer slide here. We have this fragmented system, and actually, if you'll go back one, Maya. And so emerging adults, because of this system that they're thrown into, it's the age where we have the highest dropout rates for treatment. So they often don't benefit. Emerging adults often don't benefit from the more traditional treatment options that we have, the therapeutic options, because of dropout. They're more likely to prematurely drop out than more mature adults. And even when that middle bar on this one is showing, even when initial attendance looks good, there's this slow desisters. So even when you have sort of this initial enthusiasm from emerging adults, they're still often the ones to drop out compared to more mature adults. And I'll ask what, put in the chat the average number of therapy sessions you think an emerging adult attends before they drop out. What's the average number of treatment sessions that you think people attend before dropping out? And if you can't do the chat, hold up your fingers or something. What do you want to, okay, all right, y'all know this population. Y'all know, or you've heard me talk about this before, I don't know. Yes, the average, it's most typical for emerging adults to attend only a couple of treatment sessions before dropping out. And like 70% of them will attend 3 or fewer sessions. So those of you that were in the 1, 2, and 3, you nailed it. And I don't know about you, but I don't know of any evidence-based treatment that can work that fast. So we've got to really think creatively about how to engage and serve these emerging adults. So next slide. So I really want services and funders to know what we know about emerging adults developmentally, and also to know what we know already about thinking socio-ecologically about emerging adults, about serving them, and about their typical substance use, because there are many implications that come from that knowledge when we want to think about designing services and treatments for emerging adults. So ideal services and treatments might need to target a complex set of issues and co-occurring problems. They might need to consider that complex social ecology in which emerging adults live, including an ecology that can look vastly different from one emerging adult to another. You know, when we design treatments for younger teenagers, if we take a family-based socio-ecological approach, we might really focus on, bringing in parents and having them involved in treatment and having them be a big part of treatment. But for emerging adults, their social network can have family members in it, but it may not have. It might have peers that could be powerful. It might have partners that could be powerful, or other key people, mentors and the like. And then, unlike most youth, some emerging adults might have no contact with their family. And so because of that, my work with emerging adults, we tend to focus on what we call the family of choice when we're talking about emerging adults. So we still have it be a family. I was a family therapist by training, and so we still focus on the family, but we call it the family of choice for the emerging adult. Services may also services do need to consider engagement and retention. Whenever you're talking about emerging adults, you have to think about engagement and retention, because the numbers show that this is so poor across this age group. And then flexing to those developmental differences for with which the emerging adult presents. I've learned from treatment and services with emerging adults that we have to make it more relevant for them. We have to like knock off therapy talk and lingo and sort of squeeze our psychotherapeutic techniques into something that interests them more. We have to make it not feel like therapy. And we might have to get outside of the office and be creative. In some of my work, we've done a values card sort. For those of you that know motivational interviewing, there's a values card sort, and we often do that at the beginning of intervening with a young adult, so that we can identify what their top values are. And then the focus of treatment then becomes nothing except for their top values. And we frame everything else around those top values and helping them to live out those values. We thread in CBT and other types of techniques into that, but we try to make it not feel like CBT and feel like therapy. Instead, we try to make it where it's focused on their values. And then also, for those of you that might be working in peer recovery support services, you can see how every single one of these items and what I've talked about it could be met to some extent with peer recovery support services. I do want to I'll give some other specific examples, just hit upon them for my work, and then I'm happy to answer questions about or link with people later if they're interested, if you're interested. But I'm not going to go into like a lot of detail on them, but just wanted to tell you the range of some of the work that we're doing. So I'm working with Kristen Zajac on a brief peer support intervention to target dropout. And then as part of that, we're also looking at what causes emerging adult dropout. So we're looking at things like executive functioning, motivation, and logistical barriers to sort of see what that combination is. I'm also working with Dr. Tess Drozdowski, on a task shifting project to get services to emerging adults where they are. and a couple of projects actually. So one, we're working with probation officers who are delivering contingency management for substance use. And then in another one, we're working with peer supports to deliver this vocational curriculum as a means to reduce relapse and recidivism. So the focus is on the vocational interest of the young adult versus the relapse and prevention and the recidivism prevention. Some of my work is also focused on delivering contingency management that's specifically adapted for emerging adults and their social ecology. And that comes along, we have web-based training and individualized support tools for providers specifically who are in rural locations or have sort of varied skill levels. Maybe they weren't trained as clinicians originally, and they're trying to deliver an intervention. And then other work is in the existing treatment system, and it's using a comprehensive, intensive approach. It's an adaptation of multisystemic therapy, but it's focused on emerging adults who specifically have legal system involvement and co-occurring behavioral health conditions. So that's just a flavor of some of the specific projects that I'm working on right now if folks want to connect later. Go to the next slide. There's a range of, I mentioned this sort of range of treatment targets that are routinely at play when it comes to emerging adults. They're listed here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but this is far greater an array than you would find if you're doing clinic-based work with a more mature population or even with younger teenagers. Next slide. An important area I like to focus on when it comes to talking about emerging adults is that recovery capital may look very different for emerging adults than it does for youth or more mature adults. And I won't review recovery capital because the right side of this slide lists those to give you an idea. But services are rarely prioritized to the things that young people actually value. The services rarely focus on the recovery capital that they care about. And this makes our job harder to engage young people. But I just want to say we cannot give up. We can do this. It's just you have to think creatively on how to. And service providers and funders we need to make sure that they know how to use what we already know about emerging adults, developmentally speaking and socioecologically thinking, and how family and social supports can be harnessed for this age group to tailor services to this population and get better outcomes. I have another slide that's about recovery capital research because I do like to point out, so if we'll go to the next slide, empirical research on recovery capital specifically in emerging adults is almost non-existent. Nearly all of the research on recovery capital has been with more mature adults. And there are a few things that are now being done on adolescent recovery capital that's really exciting to see. And some of the adult studies, they don't even have a single young adult in the sample. And it makes sense because a lot of that research was done with populations and samples of people in treatment programs. And we all know who's dropping. Y'all got the answers correct. Y'all know who's dropping out of those treatment programs, right? So a lot of it makes sense, but it's just something to be aware of. It's, those first slides I went through, all of these risk factors, populations in dire need of services. We need to know how do we get them to the recovery capital that's going to be needed for them to achieve and sustain recovery, but we don't know a lot about it. And so more research in this is desperately needed. I'm excited. Some of it's underway with my colleagues, but it's still very early days. Next slide. The last thing I'll have time to go through is that in one of my NIDA funded projects called the JEEP Initiative, we're using community-based participatory research to partner directly with emerging adults who are in recovery. And they are leading how to guide us to research priorities. The JEEP Initiative is specifically focused on recovery support services as a way to help emerging adults. The other focus is on adults of any age that have legal system involvement. But what I'm showing you now is the focus on emerging adults. And so I thought rather than hearing from me, that you'd be interested to hear what their perspectives, the emerging adults' perspectives were about what's important when it comes to helping them achieve and sustain recovery. So we have, in the Jeep Initiative, we have a community board that's comprised of emerging adults with lived experience, and we use community-based participatory research methods. The community board developed research priorities and ranked them. And then, and so the priority ideas, so we have priority ideas that came from 3 different community boards, but what I've focused on in the next couple of slides are the ones that were specifically prioritized by the emerging adult community boards. So some of them fell under this general domain of social support. So you can see some of them, critical elements in someone's social network, creating a positive social network, providing education to parents, reducing stigma. Go to the next slide. So interestingly, for me at least, the emerging adults were particularly concerned about and prioritized. Again, they came up with hundreds of research questions, but the prioritization of those was really interesting. They were particularly concerned and prioritized a lot of questions about underserved communities. So culturally relevant triggers for substance use, increasing access, taking into account, increasing access specifically for underserved populations. Taking into account all facets of the individual's identity within services, and increasing representation of people in recovery services, and then just a lack of recovery housing for particular populations. Next slide. A few other questions were highlighting the unique journey and resilience factors for emerging adults. I found that pretty interesting. So that they took that sort of positive frame of resilience, and also reducing reoccurrence of substance use. Next slide. And then finally, they had some priorities that were around service structure and access. So barriers to quality help, co-occurring disorders there, and discrimination within the healthcare setting. And you'll see across a number of these that there was this really strong equity lens, and overall just sort of a very interesting focus on social justice and equity themes throughout. You can go to the next slide. So I thought I would touch on this first. For any of you considering community-based participatory research with emerging adults specifically, it's utterly rewarding, but be forewarned, it is utterly difficult because of all of those developmental reasons that I was talking about earlier. And so it's a little tangential, and but I wanted to, if it's a strong interest, this is a strong interest of mine, and if it's a strong interest to anyone else, I'm also happy to link with you offline to discuss these things more, because I am so passionate on, even though it's hard, I want us to figure it out and do better with it. These are some of the lessons learned specifically on our CBPR work with emerging adults. The recruitment, it's just far harder to recruitment. Finding them in the first place is hard, and you have to think creatively. Just the language and the terminology that you use. Young adults often don't identify with the term recovery. They don't identify with having a substance use disorder. That is not always something they identify with. And so just knowing that, finding that out after the fact. Turnover is also much higher than expected. Tracking people down is much harder. Another slide. We have a couple slides on lessons learned. Building that trust and collaboration, what they do in the meetings when we have multiple community boards, and what the young adults do in their meetings looks very different, because they drive what's being done in their meetings, and what is done in their meetings is different than what is other. The young adult board for the Jeep Initiative, they are using guided meditation and mindfulness, so a lot of different things. One more slide on lessons learned. Just sort of the communication challenges. People, in academia, I'm used to using research circles. I'm used to using email a lot, but it's a very different utilization of communication channels. Next slide, I just couldn't help myself but putting in a shameless plug for the Jeep Initiative. So please look us up and link with us. We have a forum series that's coming up soon, and It's about peer supports and the standards that came out this past year. So that might interest some of you if you link with us. Next slide. Oh, and this was interestingly, one thing that grew out of our community-based participatory research work with the young adults was this tip sheet for emerging adults about finding the right 12-step meeting that would work better for them. We you know, again, from the research side, we know from developmental research that social connectedness and positive peers and family supports when that's available, that those are key to sustained success. But when it comes to emerging adults, they're perhaps the least likely to feel welcome in the fellowships. And so this document came out of our collective partnership with emerging adults, trying to help other young adults find ways and learn ways to find the right fit for them to benefit from a type of mutual aid service. And this also, that sort of process of coming up with this, it circles around to another passion of mine about having more people in recovery who are leading the future of research, because these are the important kinds of questions that need to be talked about and need to come up. And having folks that are in recovery can help us get there faster and do better work. Next slide. And then for this one, I just always hate leaving people who are in the trenches. I know this is an audience that has a lot of providers. I hate leaving folks with a lot of just a bunch of like factoids and research ideas and, you know, what I have on my soapbox, but not like real world actionable things. So I tried to gather a few ideas on this slide that are my go-to when it comes to helping to working with emerging adults directly. And so I mentioned the values mapping process that we use with emerging adults, the social network, this family of choice idea that we use, and thinking about ways of leveraging and developing an emerging adult social network to be more effective for them, but doing it in a way where we're keeping the young adult in the driver's seat. And so really empowering the emerging adult to be the one developing their skill sets to make their social network be more effective for them. Motivational interviewing skills, we have found those are really critical to getting and keeping emerging adults engaged. And again, goes with those sky-high dropout rates. And then with that, cognitive behavioral interventions can be relied on really well, but you just find ways to not make it feel like therapy. Make it, you know, work on vocational goals and have them practice CBT skills towards those vocational goals, so sort of squeezing them in. And then finally, that community-based participatory research work that we saw those themes, and it makes me know we need to continue recommending those partnerships and helping those young adults be a bigger part of the work we're doing. And then I guess the last thing with that last piece of that partnering is you know, especially for peer recovery support services, they work on engaging young adults in a very unique way and learning from that. And oftentimes what I see that gets me excited about peer recovery support services with this age group is that they're working to get young adults engaged in like normal, quote unquote, normal adult activities, things like sustainable hobbies and activities and time fillers. That, you know, the power of those pro-social activities, it goes a long way. It builds out their social ecology. It you know, increases some of their recovery capital. But it's one of those things that we just forget about as more mature adults. How do you get to the point of having, when all you've done in your social time has been using substances? How do you learn to live? And how do you have those activities and find those activities and build interest? And that's just something that I think we forget in the context of clinic-based therapy and, you know, medication-focused services, and thinking more broadly about that. But it's an area where I feel like peer recovery supports are way ahead of us on that. So thank you all for being attentive, and please let me. I didn't keep up with the chat, but please let me know how I can better help you.
Ashli, fantastic. That was just really wonderful to listen to. Thanks for that lovely overview and the really nice contextualization and kind of dynamic course of development that you contextualize this young adult phase in. It was just really, again, thank you for all your work in this area. It's just, isn't it, just such an important area that you really delineated very well and highlighted that kind of density of pathology in that 18 to 25-year-old. Everything happens there, as the rubber hits the road. In that period, you got all this onset of SUD, of mental health, of suicide, of poverty. People are the poorest, most transitional at that time in terms of moving around. And you really highlighted all this and just how, from a developmental perspective, just what a challenge it is for the human organism through time as they develop. What was also interesting that you brought up for me was the zeitgeist as well. It's not just about the kind of the biopsychosocial development, but in context of the socio-political context that you mentioned. Right now there's this focus on intersectionality, on identities and different kinds of identities, and social justice, which is a critically important issue at the moment because of what we've seen in the media with people's lives being affected and ended. And so it's also, isn't it, it's the kind of the zeitgeist at the time, people getting into this age range, now as opposed to 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So you've got those contextual factors as well, the socio-political context occurring as well when we look back over time at this particular developmental period. So, I'm always amazed when I look back, prior to 1950, when you look at this age range, they actually had the lowest rates of alcohol and other drug use in this age range. Now they're the highest when you look at people born after 1960. So obviously there's a cultural shift there in terms of, availability, accessibility, cultural mores, et cetera, that have changed over time as well. So all this, I think, is really interesting to look at. Do we have questions in the chat for Ashli? Ashli, thanks again.
Yes, we have a couple questions that's come through the Q&A. So I can go ahead and read some of those. We have some great questions. The first one we have that came in says, does research data show any increase in the effectiveness of contingency management for the emerging adult population as compared to other adults?
That's a great question. I am not aware of any, and I would be curious if there is even even within studies where you've been able to have some emerging adults, the numbers just may not be high enough. It is, I do studies with young adults, right? This age group is harder to recruit and retain in research than any other age group. And so I would even suspect that it would be difficult to do age breakdowns for looking at contingency management or any other intervention effectiveness. There's been a little bit in the mental health world of looking at effectiveness, and there are lower success rates for I believe it was specific to schizophrenia outcomes and medication and outcomes related to emerging adults compared to older, more mature adults. But it's a great question, and one I'd love to, if anyone on the line knows, I'd love to know more about any differences that folks have found for contingency management.
Awesome. And then we have another question in the chat, came from Jordan. Jordan asked, thank you for the informative presentation. You mentioned that EAs don't identify with the recovery or substance use disorder labels. How would you recommend researchers and community partners connect with and retain EAs in recovery supports, specifically when discussing inclusion criteria for participation? Does labeling a resource as recovery support dissuade participation?
That is also a great question, and I do know, like, as far as labeling, that we went through and talked with our young adult board about even like using opioid use disorder or using terminology like disorder, and they gave us feedback. And I am blanking on what they suggested, but we changed our website to map onto what they suggested. We didn't talk with them specifically about recovery support services, but that's one that and sort of alternate terminology And you know, I've heard young adults talk about help instead of support. But it's tough because recovery support services, even for funding, right? That things have to be sort of labeled in certain ways, and so it's really tough to figure out how to walk that line. But I'd love to take that back to the young adults that we're working with and seeing if they have opinions or suggestions. I also think some of the like recovery community centers, I think folks are using whole health and other sort of whole person ideas and language to try to focus more on health instead of the fixing the problem, to try to attract and retain this age group.
Wonderful. Yeah, so another question we have, what are your thoughts on some college campuses being resistant to allowing peer support services, services delivered by emerging adults with lived experience in mental health or substance use challenges? The barriers the colleges often cite are often liability-based, despite the increasing acceptance of the value and legitimacy of certified peer professionals.
Yeah, this is a great one. And I want to touch on this in general, that if you're not in an organization that where you know what your hiring practices are for people that have lived experience with, in particular, lived experience in the legal system, I encourage you, go find out, go ask, because a lot of times I'm finding there are policies that are in place that were put into place decades ago. And people often want to make, a lot of HR professionals want to make these things different, but find out what the policies are and see if there's it could be a movement to change some of those. So that's one thing I like to leave people with. But there's enough data now on the collegiate recovery movement that I think you have enough resources to be able to show that it can make changes on campus, that not just for individuals with substance use, it can make big changes for folks to really with substance use disorders. It can make broader changes for safety amongst college populations. So utilize the resources. I know we've connected with a lot of the collegiate recovery programs across the country. There's a national association. If you're not familiar with that, I know there are people on the call now that could probably pop information into the chat. But link with them to get the resources you need to push back against that, because I think there's very clear data on this now that could make a difference for you being able to get changes on your college campuses.
All right, and then we have another question asking if you could say more about how emerging adults refer to their life development in terms that are different than self-identifying as being in recovery.
Yeah, I think that folks just in some instances they don't view themselves as having had been sick with it or a disorder, and that sort of isn't. So it's like, you're in recovery from what? Like you had to sort of identify that in the first place to have, and sometimes it's just a lack of knowledge, where they think, oh well, I never got diagnosed by a physician, and so therefore I didn't have a disorder because I wasn't diagnosed officially. So sometimes there's just sort of we're using the language we're using is just not we're not tapping into the right information and sort of understanding that. Yeah, I don't know what the solution is. I think it's just talking to the young adults in your community and figuring out what's the other terminology that would fit better for them. And I think it's more about their experience. They were struggling, and substance use may have been the lesser of things that was a part of their struggle. And so it's figuring out how to characterize and frame the things that where they were struggling, and how the supports and help that they needed to be able to get through those struggles that they either received and want others to be able to have, or that they could think about could have helped them to get through those struggles faster or more easily. And it's a focus. It's sort of I mean, they were bringing up terms like resilience, right? That was coming from the young adult board, and it's figuring out how to not have it just focused on the substance use, but more on those recovery capital. You know, there's this idea, the measurement is one issue that comes up frequently, and it's about like all of our studies focus, not all of our studies, a lot of the studies focus on abstinence as the result, right? That's our primary outcome, is abstinence. And what we're hearing is that, you know, let's look more broadly at those recovery capital outcomes, or other outcomes that are going to sustain recovery in a lifestyle where they'll be able to be successful. And so that, I think it's thinking in terms of those recovery capital, and maybe that's a place to go to, is the terminology that's used in recovery capital. That might get you more interest from young adults. And I see a couple of folks have put into the chat as well. So sober curious and some of these other terminologies that might be more useful.
Yeah, we found also, just to add onto that, Ashley, you know, just again, it kind of intersects with another variable, which is severity and chronicity and impairment. So if, you know, the more severe you are, the more severe history you've had with substance involvement and impairment, the more likely you are to identify in recovery, irrespective of age. So again, this is another complicating, another kind of independent of age, that these chronicity and impairment factors. We found this across the board in our national recovery study, for example, that about half of those who resolved a significant drug or alcohol problem do not identify as being in recovery. So even though they would say this is irrespective of age, that they do not identify despite the fact that they had a significant drug or alcohol problem. But the markers, the kind of predictors of the ones that did, just like as you alluded to, the ones who are more severely affected by it, that has more salience and relevance, and also more threat, that they want to incorporate that more as a part of their identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And possibly because they may have been exposed to services where terminology like recovery and recovery from substance use disorders, where that terminology was something they got exposure to.
Another question we have, we might have
probably got time for one more. Yep.
Time for one more. Gotcha. So we have a question that says, do you recommend harm reduction as much as recommending an abstinence model?
Yeah, I think if especially with emerging adults, this is with any age group, but if you are going to ignore harm reduction, you're going to lose, I don't know, if I had to put a number on it, I would say, you know, 60-75% of your young adults, you're going to lose if you don't start with a harm reduction approach. And oftentimes, even in contingency management, where, you know, a lot of CM is abstinence is the goal because you've got a test, right? It's the instant test. Even with that, we will often talk about harm reduction as our starting point and just focus on, you know what, let's work on things that are the most, have the highest risk factors. So the substances that would have a highest risk factor, and let's not worry about these other substances for now, and let's just do our contingencies based on that. But oftentimes what then happens is, as we talk about those, we talk about the triggers for substance use. Remember, polysubstance use is high rate here for young adults. You talk about the triggers, oftentimes it'll be the same triggers. So as they're making some headway on one, they're also reducing some use of some of the others. And so we very consistently focus on harm reduction, because otherwise you might as well just give it. You're going to lose the vast majority of your young adult clients that you're working with. Which I know is not dissimilar from other age groups.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ashley. And I love the emphasis, you know, on the values, and, you know, because, you know, I think, you know, one of the things that we need to do with younger people who have not been yet as severely impacted by substance use disorders, even though they're prevalent, they're not as severe on average, is how do we attract and engage them sooner in the course of the illness? And so this focus on harm reduction and anything that we can get a hook, get them to have a hook, you know, a hook into them, as it were, to attract and engage them in something, in some kind of activity that will be towards health, you know, towards health and earlier intervention. Because we do know that, you know, the earlier that we can intervene, the shorter the time to remission. Your boss, Michael Dennis, has shown that very nicely, that if we can provide some kind of intervention earlier, even if it's brief, they get into remission sooner than they would otherwise. So thanks for mentioning all of that, and just for a terrific review and talk, and really kind of a, just an appetizer for me to really, once again, really focusing on this particular age group. Thanks for that highlight today. So thanks everybody for coming. Great to see everybody. Let's thank Ashli. And we will see you next time. I think it's in February, our next one, right, Maya?
Yep.
And don't
February.
forget, February. So look out for the email and look on the website. We'll have this archived, of course. And don't forget, please spread the word about opioidresponsenetwork.org, free technical assistance and support services free of charge for any clinician, any agency that needs it, wants it around the country. So let people know about that. And thanks everybody for your attention. And thanks again, Ashli, for a great talk today.